All right, so last week we covered, or we finished up lesson number 12 last week, or 11, I'm sorry. So this week we'll hop into lesson number 12, talking about biblical giving and our offering back to God. One of the key themes or the key points of this particular lesson number 12 is we want to focus on the attitude in which we give. We know that we give back to God in several ways, specifically when we give our offering back to the church. God, He wants us to do so with a cheerful attitude, right? He wants us to give back to Him grateful and thankful, because that's our opportunity to show God just how much we appreciate God and everything that He has done for us, right? So when it's time for us to give back to God, one of the key things that we want to keep in mind is focusing on our attitude and how we give back to God, having a cheerful spirit, right? Because like you say, we financial wise, we all in a different position, but one thing about it, when we give back to God, we must have a grateful attitude with whatever we give or we offer back to God, right? We want to do so with a cheerful heart, you know. Flip, if you would, 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse number 7, and that's going to be the foundational verse for this particular study, or lesson number 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse number 7. And we're going to see what Paul is going to say here about giving. Okay, if everybody there, 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 7, Paul says, speaking on offering or giving back to God, Paul says, each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver, right? So in other words, Paul is saying that whatever we decide to offer back to God, whatever we decide to give back to God, Paul said that it ought to be from the heart. We ought to do it not under compulsion, or we should not do it with a reluctant heart, right? But in other words, he said that whatever we give back to God, we must be a cheerful giver, right? So just for example, you got that $10 bill, you want to give it back to the God, but something in your mind saying, well, should I keep my $10 or should I give it back to God? Well, that's the ideal of having a compulsive heart, right? Or a heart not wanting to give back to God, right? Paul, he teaches us that we shouldn't have that type of heart, right? But Paul, he teaches us that whatever we give back to God, we ought to have it set aside for Him. And when we do give it back to the God, we ought to give it back to Him as a cheerful giver, right? Okay, so Paul, he sets that, or he gives us that scripture. So he sets that foundation. He doesn't say how much to give, but look at what he places emphasis on, and that's how one ought to give, or the attitude we ought to have when we are giving, right? And that attitude, like we say, is what we ought to have. What kind of heart when we give back to God? A cheerful heart, right? Or a joyful heart, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind as we go throughout our lesson number 12, as we study the biblical concept of offering and giving. All right, any questions or comments on anything up to now? So the objective of this particular lesson or series is to understand that giving, it is an act of our worship to God, right? It is a part of our stewardship, and offering or giving back to the God. It reflects our faith and our generosity towards God, right? So in other words, what we give back to God or what we offer back to God, it shows God how much we appreciate Him, right? So just like it's an old saying that says, You give a little, expect to receive little, right? You give abundantly, then expect to receive abundantly blessings, right? And like you say that our blessings when we give back to the Lord, it doesn't always come back to us financial wise, but it can come back to us all kind of ways, right? We may be having some health issues, and the Lord, He blesses us to remove that issue, or He gives us some kind of relief from a particular sickness. You may be on a job. The Lord may move you to another position or give you a promotion on your job. It doesn't always have to come back to us financially, but it can come back to us. The blessings of God can come back to us all kinds of ways sometimes that we don't even understand or we don't recognize, right? The fact that God woke us up this morning, He blessed us all with some transportation and traveling grace, blessing from God, right? And that's something that we ought to be thankful for and show gratitude, giving thanks to God, right? All right, so we know that giving is a part of worship. It is a part of our stewardship as Christians, and it requires us to have faith, right? So when we give back to God, we do so through faith, right? Because what I mean by that is when it comes to faith, we don't physically see God because He's a spirit, right? So when we give back to God, or when we drop in that offering plate, or however we give back to God, it's an act of faith, right? We can't see physically with our eyes Jesus or God because they are spirit. So when we offer back to God or whatever we set aside, we do so through faith, right? And remember, I know this is not on the sheet, but Hebrews 11:6, it says that without faith, it is impossible to please God, right? So we know that whenever we offer back to God, whatever we give back to God, it's all through faith, right? And what we mean by that is simply believing that God is going to provide all of our needs. But first, we got to make sure that we take care of God, right? Because reality, well, this leads to our first point. We must realize that God, He owns everything, right? So even though we may have a banking account, checking account, or whatever, that's God's own. He just puts it in our possession, right? Because in reality, God can take it all away from us, right? Because He's the one that gave it to us in the first place, right? So that's one key thing that we must remember and keep in mind when we're talking about having an attitude to give back to God, right? It's the fact that whatever God blesses us with, that vehicle that He may give us, the clothes, the shelter, the home that He has placed us in. Remember, God, He puts us in all of that, He just allows us to live in it, or He allows us to drive that vehicle, because of the goodness of God. But the fact of the matter is, God, He has control over all of that. He just blesses us to have it for a little while, right? And because of that, we ought to always give God praise, right? Okay, let's look at Psalms 24. If somebody want to flip to Psalms 24 and verse 1, Old Testament book, Psalms chapter 24. Somebody read verse number 1 for me. And what we're doing is we're pointing out the fact that God, He owns everything, and everything belongs to Him. Psalms chapter 24 and verse number 1. Okay.
The earth is the Lord's, all it contains, the world and those who live in it.
Right. So once again, we see in the psalmist, he's writing, he's showing us that the earth, it belongs to the Lord, right? And he says that, and all that is within the earth, it belongs to the Lord, right? So just like we're saying, even though God may allow us to have some things, but God is ultimately the owner of all things. He just blesses us and puts us in position, or he allows us to have possessions of some of the things. But ultimately, God, he owns everything, right? And that's what David points out in Psalms 24. He says that the earth is the Lord's. So in other words, everything on the earth, or the earth itself, belongs to the Lord, right? And as his children, he just allows us to be able to enjoy some of the possessions of life, whatever that may be. Like we talked about, he blesses us with food, clothing, shelter. He blesses us with good health. Because like I was talking with someone, you can't put a price tag on good health, right? Because as many people who are sick who wish they could buy good health, but you can't buy good health, right? That's only blessing from the Lord. So whenever the Lord blesses us with strength and good health, that's something that our finances can't buy, right? So for that, we ought to always be thankful that the Lord, he blesses us with things such as good health, right? All right, so let's look at Old Testament prophet Haggai, chapter 2, and verse number 8. I know that's a small Old Testament prophecy book, real small book in the Old Testament. We'll give everybody a chance to get there. It's Old Testament book, Haggai. And we're going to see what the prophet says about the Lord and how he understood the blessings of the Lord. Yeah, it's Old Testament, Haggai. It's only 2 chapters in that prophecy. So it'll be 2 books before Matthew. Yeah. One of the really smaller Old Testament prophecies or prophets. Just 2 chapters. Book of Haggai. And we're going to see how he viewed the Lord and the Lord's possessions. Chapter 2 and verse number 8, I believe. Yeah. All right. So when somebody get there, you gonna get there, brother.
The silver is mine, the gold is mine, and
Declares the Lord.
declares the Lord.
Right. So Haggai, he understood, the old prophet of the Old Testament, he understood that the silver and the gold belongs to the Lord, right? So in other words, speaking from an Old Testament prophecy, he relates possessions or everything in the world, he relates it as silver and gold, right? So he acknowledges that even the silver and the gold is the Lord's, right? So we must understand once again that even though we may possess some of these things, we may have some of these things in our possession, ultimately they belong to the Lord, right? All right. Any questions or comments on Haggai chapter 2 and verse number 8? If not, we will move right on to our next section. So in summary, these 2 verses have pointed out that everything we possess or everything that we have, it belongs to God. We are stewards, not owners. So anybody, what does it mean to be a steward? What does it mean to be a steward? Or what's the opposite of a steward? So if I'm a steward of something, do I own it or is it mine? If I'm a steward, right, I'm not the owner, I'm just one who possesses something, right? So right, I'm just over it. Like we often look at stewards in the church. We have stewards, You have some congregations have elders and deacons, right? They are stewards over God's people, right? Or elders over God's people. Or in other words, they don't own God's people, or that they don't control God's people, but God has put them in place to oversee, right? In the same example for us today, God has made us stewards over the things that He blesses us with, right? And we are not just owners, but ultimately everything belongs to the Lord, right? Okay, so discussion question right here. Okay, it says, how does recognizing God's ownership change our view of money and possessions? How does recognizing God's ownership change our view of our money and possessions? Anybody would like to respond to that? Well, first, I would start off. I would say this: recognizing that God, He owns everything. Right. It gives us a humble attitude, right? Or it gives us a meek spirit to know that everything that we have, it belongs to God, right? So, in other words, when it's time to give back to God, or when it's time to show Him that we appreciate what He has done for us, it kind of gives us a humble spirit, right? Because in the first place, we know that everything that we have or we possess, it doesn't really belong to us, right? It belongs to the God, right? And like we say, because God give it to us, He can also take it away from us, right? So that's one thing that we have to keep in mind, right? I know some people say, well, I don't give to God. Well, you got a hole in your pocket, right? So in other words, if God gives you something and then you don't give back to Him, showing Him that He appreciates, then He can take it away from you, right? Doesn't mean that He always would take it away, but we know that can happen, right? Because He has the last say so in our possessions, right? All right. So recognizing God's ownership, it gives us a humble and meek spirit to be willing to give back to God, to be willing to make that sacrifice back to Him. And like we just talked about, when we do give back to God, we ought to have what kind of attitude?
Willing attitude, a cheerful attitude.
Right. We have to have a cheerful, willing attitude when it's time to give back to God, right? All right. Any questions or comments on giving back to God and understanding that all our possessions that we have belongs to God? Any questions or comments? All right. So if not, we'll hop right into number 2, and understanding that giving or offering, it is an act of Christian worship, right? So let's take a look at Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 9. Proverbs chapter 3, another Old Testament wisdom book. And that's going to be right after Psalms, actually. Proverbs chapter 3. And we're once again going to see how the wise man instructed us to look at our wealth and also look at the things that we have, or how we should consider our possessions and the things that we have, right? Remember also keeping it in mind that these Old Testament writers, they understood that everything that they had in their possession, it ultimately belonged to the Lord, right? Or to God. All right, so Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 9, the writer says, honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all of your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine, right? So the Old Testament Proverbs, he writes from the perspective of farming, right? He refers to the idea of produce, right? He says that first that we are to honor the Lord from our wealth, right? And he also says, and from the first of our produce, right? So when he says the first of our produce, how does that reflect, or how does that speak to us today? The writer says that we ought to give to the Lord from the first of our produce, right?
Right.
Well, we can look at it as this way. When he says give from the first of your produce, in other words, the writer is saying that today, when we give back to God, it ought to come from our first, or it ought to come from our best, right?
Right.
And like you say, we all from a different financial background, but one example can be when if someone's work and they get paid, right? Well, the Lord is saying, okay, you worked all week long, you got paid $500. Just using it for example. The Lord saying, okay, you ought to give from that $500 or that first produce, right? Don't wait until you don't spend all your money. Don't wait until you don't pay all your bills. You don't got your hair did. You don't went shopping. Now you want to give to God $5. You know, the Proverbs writer says, don't do that. He says when you give from your first, or give, or right. So before anybody else get taken care of, or before you give anything else, the Proverbs writer, he says, make sure that you take care of the Lord, right? And he uses this from a farming perspective. I don't think none of us have a farm today. We don't grow crops, right? But he says, or he teaches in Proverbs 9 that we ought to give of our first produce. From an Old Testament perspective, that would mean whenever the farmer would go out and plant a crop, and then it was time to harvest, or it was time to go out and gather the crops, the Lord would say, give me mine first. You know, or for example, if someone raises a hog or a cattle, and you kill that cattle and then you get the meat, they make sacrifices. So the Lord would be saying, give me the first portion of your sacrifices, you know, from the Old Testament perspective of farming and also produce. And watch what he also says. He says, when you honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first fruit of your produce, then your barns will be filled with plenty. So he says that when you give to God what's due to God rightly, he said that the Lord, he will fill your barns, right? So in other words, for us today, when we give back to God and when we do it right, like we pointed out, we do it with a cheerful attitude, and we do it from the first of our produce, then the Proverbs writer said that the Lord will bless you abundantly, right? He just didn't say that he would give you some, but he said that he will what? Fill up your barns, right? So there's a big difference between receiving some and then having a whole bunch or filled up, right? And the Proverbs writer, he points out that whenever we give back to the God from our first produce, then the Lord, he will fill our barns, or he will give back to us in plenty, right? All right, any questions or comments on Proverbs chapter number 3 and verse number 9? Any questions or comments? Understanding the importance of giving to God our first of all of our produce, of all of our earnings, right? All right, let's look at Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6, we're in the New Testament. We're looking at the first book of the New Testament, Matthew chapter 9. I'm sorry, Matthew chapter 6
21.
and verse 21. Yes, sir. And one thing about this is Jesus speaking in the text right here, right? And Jesus is going to speak on our possessions and our treasures, right? Verse 21, if you got it, anybody can read verse 21.
For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also.
Right, so the Lord, we can even go back to verse 20. Jesus says, but store up for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust can destroy, and where thieves cannot break in and steal.
Right.
And then he says in verse 21, for where your treasures is, there will also be your heart, right?
Right.
So in other words, Jesus is teaching the people the fact that we ought to store up our treasures in heaven, right?
Right.
In other words, he's saying that whenever we place our faith in heavenly things, those things cannot be destroyed, right? And neither can thieves break in or steal treasures in heaven, right? So he said that for where your treasures is, there also will be your heart. So if you place more value and you place more love on earthly possessions,
Right.
Jesus says that's where your heart will be, right?
Right.
I know sometimes, for example, we can say you may have a nice big 2-story house.
Right.
Well, if you place your heart and your trust in that 2-story house, God or Jesus said there also where your heart will be. But if you place your faith in Christ, knowing that one day He has a place prepared for you in heaven, Jesus says,
can't break in there and take it from you.
right. Good. Like you say, nobody can break in.
From you around here.
Right. Yep. And that's what Jesus points out. He points out that thieves can break in and steal stuff on this earthly side.
Right.
But when you place your faith and you place your trust in heavenly things and in Jesus, He said there also where your heart will be, right? And that's real good. The things that we have down here, they can be stolen.
Right.
God forbid, but it's the truth of the matter. Thieves can come in and take it. So we have to be mindful that these physical things that we have, they're only temporary. They can be destroyed, or like you say, they can be stolen or taken. So Jesus, He teaches the people to place your faith in things in the treasures of heaven, and they're also where your heart will be, right?
Right.
All right. Any questions or comments on Matthew chapter 6 and verse 21? Or is there any questions or comments about anything that we have covered from this first particular page? We like to say we want to walk through this text and get a good understanding of how Jesus and the Lord, He looks at our giving. We want to make the argument or lay the foundation that giving is an act of our worship to God. It's a commandment. And if I could say 2 key things that we can take away from today is, one, realizing that God owns everything, and also the idea that when we give or we offer back to God, we ought to do so with a cheerful and joyous attitude, right?
Right.
All right, so those 2 things that we want to keep in mind as we wrap up lesson 1 or page 1, and we'll stop right there. We're not going to hop into any other new content. So in summary, giving is more than just supporting ministry, but it is our way of honoring God, right? Like you may have come in contact with someone or some people, and they may say, well, why you give back to the church every first day of the week? And one of the things is just not to support the local congregation or the local church, but it's a way of showing God that we honor Him and we appreciate everything that He does for us, right?
Right.
Right, also keep that in mind. But any questions or comments on anything that we have covered up to now? Anything that may be unclear or we need to go back and revisit? Any questions? If not, we will stop right here. And God's willing, next week we will pick up on number 3.